So here we are, in the election that no one wanted. You have an important choice to make because we are either turning Canada into Trump land or we're not. Do you want a country that empowers racists, white supremacists, anti-maskers, conspiracy theorists, and climate change deniers? That's literally the question in this election. I wish I could say that the choice was more nuanced or complex than that, but it isn't. And on the Indigenous side of the equation, the choice is equally stark. Welcome back, warriors. It's election time in Canada, and while no one wanted this election, here we are, and there's no time to waste. Tomorrow is Election Day, and here's where we stand. 6 million Canadians have already voted in the advance polls. 1.2 million Canadians have received mail-in ballots, which leaves about 20 million eligible voters who could vote on Monday. And that is no small number, but we know not everyone will vote. In the 2019 election, only 67% of eligible voters cast their ballot. In 2015, it was only 68%, and in 2011, it was only 61%. And while the pandemic makes it hard to predict exactly how many will vote in this election, we can expect somewhere between 60 and 70%. That means somewhere between 12 and 14 million Canadians could vote on Monday, and some of those will be Indigenous voters. A quick note about Indigenous voting. There are many First Nations who have historically not voted in federal or provincial elections. This is for a multitude of reasons. One is because they don't feel that our sovereign nation should be voting in another government system. It's simply a matter of defending our sovereignty. And some have said that they simply don't want to vote for their next oppressor, because governments at all levels of all political stripes have continued genocidal laws, policies, and practices against Indigenous peoples. Both of these are valid reasons not to vote. On the other hand, there are many Indigenous peoples who do vote. Some vote because they want to be part of the system and help make change from within those Canadian systems. And some vote not because they support the system, but because they want to use every tool at their disposal to help influence government policy when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And both of these are equally valid reasons to engage in the vote. Then there's some people in between who don't usually vote and are against voting in the elections of the colonizer governments, but will do so from time to time strategically as a matter of harm reduction. In other words, they're not necessarily voting for a specific party, but they're voting to ensure that the worst party doesn't get in. Take, for example, the 2015 election when Indigenous peoples and Canadians both wanted to get rid of the Harper Conservatives. Both had significantly higher voter participation than in the previous election in 2011. Keep in mind, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples specifically says that as Indigenous peoples, not only do we have the right to be self-determining, but we also have the right to participate in Canadian systems if we want to. And at the end of the day, I support all Indigenous peoples who choose to vote or not vote. That's our decision to make. So whether you vote all the time, some of the time, or uncertain about whether you might vote this time, this video is for you and all of our Canadians, friends, allies, and supporters. What I plan to do in this video is give a brief overview of where the three main federal parties stand on some core Indigenous issues. No, I'm not covering the Bloc because they're not running to form government. And no, I'm not covering the People's Party of Canada because their platform is essentially the Conservative platform, just a little bit more open and honest about their racism, sexism, and harmful views. And there's no chance of them forming government. And no, this year I'm not covering the Green Party because they have some major internal governance issues and there's no chance that they'll form the government either. And for all the other assorted groups who've registered as a party, I'm not covering those either. So, where do the Liberals and NDP and Conservative stand on Indigenous issues? Well, let's start with genocide. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of both historic and ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples that specifically targets Indigenous women and girls. So, what's the plan? Well, all of their platforms plan to address unmarked graves, water on reserves, and economic development. But where specifically do they stand on the larger overarching issues of genocide, human rights, and self-determination? Well, let's start with genocide. The Liberal platform says, and I quote, "The violence endured by generations of Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ people is a national tragedy. We understand that addressing this tragedy requires a new approach that recognizes the full breadth of the problem and addresses root causes." End quote. Here's what I like about the Liberal platform. 1, they want to accelerate the implementation of their federal pathway. 2, they want to accelerate work on the National Action Plan on Murdered and Missing. And 3, they plan to create a standing federal-provincial table to coordinate this work. In a nutshell, they acknowledge that there's a problem, they've committed over $2 billion prior to the election to address it, they acknowledge that they have to get at the root causes, and recognize the need to coordinate with provinces or territories. Here's what I don't like. They didn't acknowledge it as a genocide, a national crisis requiring emergency attention. I also don't like that their pathway document is a roll-up of federal programs and services already available. It's not an actual plan to get at federal government's genocidal laws, policies, and practices. And while federal, provincial, and territorial coordination is important, there's no mention of centering Indigenous women and our representatives in this important coordination work. Now here's what the NDP had to say about genocide. "We believe that the Crown's relationship to Indigenous peoples must be based on an acknowledgement of our country's colonial history of genocide and stolen lands, and include legally binding commitments to fair and equitable redress going forward." End quote. Here's what I like about the NDP platform. 1, they're going to work with Indigenous women, families, and communities to implement all of the National Inquiry's recommendations. 2, they plan to develop a comprehensive plan to address the violence. And 3, they want to ensure equitable access to self-determination for Indigenous women over things like land, housing, childcare, education, and employment. They acknowledge this is an issue of genocide. They center working with Indigenous women, and they plan for equitable access to self-determination, which includes ending sex discrimination in the Indian Act. These are all strong points, but here's what I don't like. The NDP historicized genocide as a legacy of the past and failed to connect that to present-day genocide. Number 2, with regards to developing a national action plan, they fail to address whether they're starting over from scratch or if they're going to build on the work done by the Liberals to date. Who knows? And number 3, they fail to say how they'll ensure Indigenous women have equitable access to self-determination. Now, when it comes to the Conservative platform, they didn't have anything to say about the genocide, or a national tragedy, or a human rights crisis. They merely referred to the report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women as representing serious gaps in opportunity. Whoa, do they miss the point entirely. So if I had to pick something that I like, there's not much to choose from. There's half a sentence that says they're committed to developing a national action plan with Indigenous groups to address violence. But here's what I don't like. They mischaracterize the genocide of Indigenous women and girls as gaps in opportunity, as if a good job's going to end the ongoing crisis. Keeping in mind, this crisis originates in Canada's laws, policies, and practices, which continue to breach our human rights. They also don't commit to implementing the recommendations of the National Inquiry. And there's no centering of Indigenous women moving forward. And the rest of their platform contains commitments that would make the crisis worse, not better, like putting a fast forward on pipelines and all of the associated man camps that increase rates of violence. So let's look at human rights and dealing with systemic racism. And here's what I like about the Liberal platform. 1, they commit to strengthening the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code against hate crimes. 2, they will fully implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And 3, they plan to address systemic racism in healthcare, child and family services, and policing. Now, to their credit, the Liberals already enacted Bill C-15, which confirms UNDRIP's application in Canadian law and commits the federal government to implement it, which means that governments and courts will have to consider Indigenous rights in a whole new light. Here's what I don't like. While the Liberals strengthen the Canadian Human Rights Act on anti-hate, they themselves consistently challenge the jurisdiction and decisions of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, especially in relations to First Nations kids in foster care and the discrimination they face at the hands of federal policy. And they also don't abide by the orders of the tribunal. Number 2, while I applaud UNDRIP legislation, the Liberals are still fighting Indigenous women and girls in court and at the United Nations over ending sex and race discrimination in the Indian Act's registration provisions. Come on! Number 3, we don't need any more weak reviews of RCMP policy. We need to address racism, sexualized violence, brutality, and corruption in the RCMP with radically different measures. And similarly, committing to compensate First Nation kids in care who've been discriminated against betrays the fact that the Liberals continue to fight First Nations in court against compensating them. Now let's move to the NDP commitments on human rights and systemic racism. I like that they plan to create a national action plan for reconciliation that's grounded in human rights, that they'll fully implement UNDRIP, and they plan to address racism in healthcare, the RCMP, and child and family services. The NDP seem to understand that the full implementation of UNDRIP works together with their plans to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, the National Inquiry recommendations, Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, as well as all of the other policies like Joyce's Principle, Shannon's Dream, and Jordan's Principle. What I don't like is they haven't laid out a plan as to how they're going to do this or commit to specific measurable actions within a certain time frame. Anyone can promise anything, but how are you going to do it? I also don't like their plan for dealing with systemic racism in the RCMP. While it's a bit better than the Liberals, it's still really weak. They plan to review RCMP budgets on the one hand, but plan to increase funds for dedicated hate crime units on the other. Similarly, their plans to review use of force policies and civilian oversight are the same tired recommendations that have never worked before. However, Liberal and NDP plans are light years ahead of the Conservative plan, especially when it comes to human rights and systemic racism. Now, I sincerely tried to find something in the Conservatives' Indigenous plan that speaks to addressing racism, but they don't even acknowledge racism as an issue. I couldn't even find the word racism. They did say that water's a human right, but they're only going to address the high-risk systems on reserve. And instead of systemic racism, they see the problem as isolated communities, less networking opportunities, and the need for capacity building like board governance training. They clearly don't get it. On every human rights issue, they fail to either address state-based or government racism and societal racism. In fact, they plan to repeal some of the human rights protections in the Canadian Human Rights Act. They have no plan to implement UNDRIP, and certainly no mention of remedying the discrimination against First Nation kids in foster care, sex discrimination in the Indian Act, or racism in healthcare and policing. On the issue of self-determination, here's what I like about what the Liberals have to say. 1, implementing UNDRIP. 2, supporting the revitalization of Indigenous laws, and 3, fostering a nation-to-nation relationship that focuses on a transition out of the Indian Act and towards negotiated agreements. Now, UNDRIP recognizes our inherent rights to be self-determining and integral to moving ahead. is the recognition of Indigenous laws, which reinforce our sovereignty and jurisdiction over our own territories. I also prefer the transition approach to dealing with the Indian Act versus simply repealing it without any legal protections. But here's what I don't like. It'll take more than merely engaging on UNDRIP to support self-determination. It also requires land back and control over our own resources. This must be central to the plan, and I don't see any land back plan in the Liberal platform. I like that the Liberals are supporting Indigenous laws, but these laws must run the full gambit, not just laws over local matters. It also must include laws over land, environment, national security, and international trade, for example. And while negotiated agreements are the best way to go, the current negotiating tables are missing the voices of hundreds of thousands Indigenous women and children that Canada has failed to restore to their First Nations, so they don't get a say in what's happening. And worse, these negotiations require surrendering rights in one form or another. Now, the NDP's self-determination agenda, I like that they're going to implement UNDRIP, that they are going to focus on equitable access for Indigenous women to self-determination. And I like that they're saying that they'll respect our sovereignty, our rights, our land title, and control over our territories. Obviously, UNDRIP goes hand in hand with self-determination, and centering Indigenous women is critical to that. So is fully respecting our sovereignty and land rights. What I don't like is the failure of the NDP to state how they're going to respect our sovereignty. What specific measures will they put in place to turn that into recognition for our land rights and our governing rights? And where's their land back plan? That being said, the Conservative platform on self-determination is at the other end of the spectrum. I read through their Indigenous section and tried to find something substantive that supports real self-determination, and there is nothing. They have a section called self-determination, but they define self-determination as, and I'm quoting, service delivery on First Nations reserves. No, delegated authority from the federal government to deliver grossly underfunded federal programs and services on reserves? That's not self-determination. That's what we're doing now. The Conservatives also failed to implement UNDRIP. In fact, they voted against it. They fail to recognize our land rights and, of course, don't have a land back plan. And their focus is on Indigenous corporations engaged in the extractive industry instead of actual First Nations governance. And that's evidence that they have no plan to respect our Indigenous sovereignty, jurisdiction, laws, or rights. Overall, the Liberal and NDP plans address, at least to some extent, the issues related to genocide, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, human rights, systemic racism, self-determination, and right. The Conservatives, on the other hand, with few, very limited exceptions, do not. This tracks across other related issues as well: women's rights, childcare, healthcare, and climate change. Across all of those issues, the Conservative platform is an outlier and stands in stark contrast to Liberal and NDP platforms. In fact, the Conservative platform resonates most closely with that of the People's Party of Canada. Not a surprise, given the cross-pollination of values between these two groups. Now, I'm sure most people consider a variety of factors before they vote, like what federal leaders say on the campaign trail. But I would caution to compare what they're saying to their party policies on those issues and what's actually in their platform. People can say lots of things one-on-one, but you're not voting for that leader. You are voting for that party. Take, for example, Aaron O'Toole, leader of the Conservatives. He might say, I fully support women's rights, but if his platform allows restricted access to abortions by bolstering so-called conscious rights of doctors, then you know that the party has different intentions. It's also important to remember his party's votes on restricting access to abortions and O'Toole's own past voting record. I'm not just picking on the Conservatives here, because we can and should do the same level of scrutiny for all the parties. The NDP's refusal to state openly their position on Trans Mountain Pipeline in the context of climate and Indigenous rights, that's a problem. Whatever happened to open and accountable and transparent governance and leadership? Similarly, the Liberals saying that they are not fighting First Nations in court, while we continue to literally watch the court proceedings online. Come on! Then, of course, you have to look at historical performance, promises that have been made versus promises that have been kept. And while some parties have not kept all of their promises, the failure to commit any action on Indigenous rights should stand out as a major red flag. And it's also important to understand that this is our first election since the insurrection at the US Capitol, after years of Trump empowering racists, sexists, conspiracy theorists, climate change and pandemic deniers, and anti-maskers. Canada is not immune to the rise of far-right populism and its potentially dangerous implications for our collective safety and security. Now, I've been very open about the fact, both in the media and in my writings, that I am one of those Indigenous peoples who haven't traditionally voted in federal or provincial elections. For me, it's a matter of sovereignty and where I choose to put all of my energy, which I would rather put into nation building in our First Nations. However, I am so concerned about what I see when I do an analysis of all of these party platforms, historical performances, what people are saying in and out of Parliament, what they represent, what the individual parties represent, that I'm strongly considering for this year being like some of those Indigenous peoples who vote strategically on an exceptional basis to prevent harm to our communities. I consider the issues that serious this year, especially given the alarming rise in far-right populism. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to land on that issue yet. However, I do hope that my video and my writings and analysis that I have been sharing far and wide help you in your deliberations. If I had time, I would have done a video on all of the issues: Indigenous, women's issues, climate change, systemic racism, pandemic measures, and all of those issues that we care so much about. However, I have done some writing on that, so I'll post links to my analysis on all of those issues, which I wrote for CTV News, The Lawyer's Daily, Canadian Dimension, The Breach, and a forthcoming one for Maclean's. You can also access them all on my website under Publications. There's a special election section. So let me know what you think. What are you thinking about all of these platforms and what the leaders are saying? Please leave your comments below. Until next time, stay alert, warriors.